Through these Sundays of Advent, we've been journeying together through the birth stories as they come to us from the different sources in the New Testament. And this morning we'll take some time looking at the birth story from the Gospel according to Luke. However, given the events of this past week, I want to adjust what I had planned to say to include some thoughts and some responses to all that's happened. And then at the end of my sermon, I have a word of challenge for each of us. Luke's story of the birth of Jesus is populated by angels, shepherds, and a young woman who found favor with God. We don't know what the shepherds might have done to be worthy of angelic attention. And we don't know what it was about Mary that brought her that privileged status. But I'll suggest a few things nonetheless. I don't think the shepherds were chosen because they were particularly well-accomplished shepherds. I don't think this is the award for being the shepherd of the year. There are no adjectives or superlatives describing them. They're simply doing what shepherds do. They're keeping watch over their flocks by night. You know, we all tend to get warm and fuzzy feelings when we think of shepherds. We're the benefit of 2,000 years of such a tradition. But shepherds in the first century would not inspire such warm and fuzzy feelings. To be a shepherd meant you were probably kind of dirty. You smelled of sheep. To be a shepherd probably meant you couldn't participate in the religious life of the community because you had to keep watch over your flock when others gathered for the finer things of life. To be a shepherd, at least according to Wikipedia, in the first century, it was something of a hybrid between a homeless nomad and a migrant worker. Probably these shepherds had small flocks that would allow their family to survive, and as they went from place to place to graze those flocks, they would probably do odd jobs here and odd jobs there. No, I think to be a shepherd probably meant you were something of a failure. To be a shepherd probably meant you couldn't do much else. I wonder if there was an old folk song that went something like this. Mama, don't let your babies grow up to be shepherds. They're worthy of angelic attention because they do not have pretension. They do not live with a puffed up and overinflated ego, believing that they are more important than they really are. Luke puts them in the birth story to remind us not to be pretentious. You know, when Jimmy Carter was elected president, there was a big inaugural parade, and Miss Lillian, his mom, was there, and she was delighted to be there, and she participated in the parade, and she was given explicit instructions. Don't talk to the reporters. Instructions which she completely disregarded. And as she made her way down Pennsylvania Avenue, a reporter came up to her and said, "Miss Lillian, you must be so proud of your son." And she said, "I have two. Which one do you mean? Billy runs a gas station in Plains, Georgia, and Jimmy's going to be president." She let go of all the pretension of that day. One thinks of Montaigne. Well, I suspect I'm the only one who's thinking of Montaigne right now. And he was a Renaissance philosopher who said this: "And on the highest throne in the world, we sit on our own bottoms." I'm glad I never learned Italian, because I think he probably said it a little more coarsely than that, and he wouldn't want me to do that, would he? Angelic attention comes to the humble, not to the pretentious. And if the shepherds were chosen for no particular reason other than the fact that they were the lowest rung on the social ladder, Mary is chosen for precisely opposite reasons. Mary is chosen for the gift and the grace that she brings. And it was very simple. Mary simply said yes. The angel Gabriel came to her and said, and she said, yes. I wonder how many people the angel Gabriel went to before Mary said yes. Well, you know, in these days after the events of Newtown, Connecticut, we've all been churning inside, asking questions, struggling, trying to integrate all that happened into our understanding of life and the world. And in my agitation, I reached to my bookshelf and I pulled off a book by Peter Gomes. And I reread one of his sermons. The sermon was entitled, "The Bible and Evil." And I found his thoughts comforting and challenging, and I trust you will as well. But he says three things about evil, and I believe that what happened in Newtown, Connecticut is an expression of evil, and that if we are going to contend with evil, we might want to think very carefully about how we do that. So Peter Gomes suggests three things. The first thing he says is that evil is real. That evil is not something we make up. Evil is not simply the absence of what ought to be. That there is this real spiritual force that we struggle with. He compares it a bit to the disease cancer. And how even as you treat cancer, the cancer changes. And so in order to treat cancer well, it requires the best of our medical minds to prescribe, to follow a plan, to adjust that plan as you go along the way. First thing Peter Gomes tells us is that evil is real. The second thing he says is that the servants of good are not quite as smart as we think we are. And that is that evil does in fact have the power to delude us. Evil has the power to warp our sense of perception. Evil has the power to latch on to our pretensions, to latch on to our apathy. And just when we think we're okay, we can be deluded. Peter Gomes used to teach at the Tuskegee Institute, and while he was there, he was the custodian of one of the largest chronicles of photographs of lynchings in our nation's history. And quite frequently he would look through those photographs, confronting an evil. And he said what struck him most were the faces of those who participated in the lynching. He said it wasn't a mob acting in hysteria. They were just calm, caring, good people who had been deluded by evil to believe that God willed segregation and that lynching was a justified, necessary evil, to a justified action to preserve segregation. They weren't evil people. They were deluded. They were seduced. You see, servants of God aren't as smart as we think we are. Therefore, we need one another to gather in the community of faith and to talk not superficially about the weather, but to talk spiritually about how we perceive the nature of God and what is good and what is right, and to talk with one another with authenticity. Because evil is smart and organized, and it plays one against the other. Think about it. Evil can divide us, fracture us. If you get the American Civil Liberties Union saying horrible things about the Christian church, and the Christian church saying horrible things about the American Civil Liberties Union, righteousness is thwarted. Evil can divide us if we are not engaged with one another with a sense of honest trust. Peter Gomes said this so well. Therefore, those who would be righteous or hunger and thirst after it are and always have been evil's prime target. It is to amplify this fact and for the sake of our spiritual welfare that the Gospels make the first encounter that Jesus has after his baptism, an encounter with Satan himself. We are meant both to take notice and to take what we notice very seriously. And then I cherish these words And I invite you to weave them deeply into the fabric of your own life. With evil working overtime, virtue cannot be a hobby. With evil working overtime, virtue cannot be a hobby. That's why we must band together and be a church with a certain amount of seriousness, that we must have the fortitude to rise above the pettiness that sometimes pulls us apart, and to focus on the good and on the right. The third thing Dr. Gomes says about contending against evil is that we need all the help that we can get. We need each other. We need people who aren't in the room with us now to work together for holiness. I'd like to end my sermon by inviting you to think about something. And if you think about something, I invite you to give expression to do that. Would you be willing to pray for a moment and consider what one thing could you do? What one thing that could you do that would help make this world just a little less violent? For me, you know, it's always important to strain very carefully the religious language that I use. That even though the Bible is filled with violent images for God, I just don't use those. But what could you do? What one thing could you do differently in your life that you could help ratchet down the violence in our society? And if you think of something, I invite you to come forward, and you'll notice on the table today we have some candles. One candle for every life that was lost. And if you think of something, maybe you could tie the grief of loss to your resolve to be different. And after we've had a chance to do that, we'll pray and we'll sing. But if you think of something, come on up. Light a candle.